Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very interesting and unusual and weird experience for me to be talking in my hometown, which is... Now, amongst the books that Constance mentioned when she was introducing me, Hitchhiker's Guide, Dirk Gently, and so on, was not my favorite book. And my favorite book is what I'm here to talk about tonight. It's funny how often, virtually every author I know, their own favorite book is the one that sold the least. It's somehow, so it's the runt of the litter. It's the one you always just sort of love the most. And I want to tell you about how this came about. Sometime in about the mid-1980s, the phone rang. And a voice said, "We want you to go to Madagascar. We want you to look for a very rare form of lemur called the ai. The plane leaves in 2 weeks. We'd like you to be on it." Now, I, assuming they got the wrong number, said yes before they could discover their mistake. But in fact, it turned out that they decided, well, here's somebody who doesn't know anything about lemurs, anything about the ai, anything about Madagascar. Let's send him. And so I started to try and find out something about it. And it turns out it's very interesting. Lemurs used to be the dominant primate in all the world. And they were very, very gentle, pleasant creatures. They were a little bit like about cat size. And they used to hang around in the trees having a nice time. And then Gondwanaland split up. There's always sounds like some sort of 70s rock group going their own way for reasons of musical differences. But as you probably remember, Gondwanaland was that vast continental landmass that consisted what then became South America, Africa, India and Southeast Asia, Australasia, Australia, and and this will turn out to be significant later, not New Zealand, which turns out to be just a lot of gunk that came up from under the ocean. And as I say, lemurs were the dominant primate around the world. And when all these land masses split up, and Madagascar was one of them, Madagascar kind of sailed off into the middle of what then suddenly became the Indian Ocean, and took with it a representative sample of the livestock of the period, which included a lot of lemurs. And they basically sort of sat there for millions and millions of years in glorious isolation, while in the rest of the world, a new creature emerged, a new creature arrived that was much more intelligent than the lemurs, according to it, much more competitive, much more aggressive, and incredibly interested in all the things you could do with twigs. Twigs were absolutely wonderful. There's so much you can do with twigs. You can dig in the ground for things with twigs. You can burrow under the bark of trees for grubs. You can hit each other with twigs. If there had been copies of Twig User magazine around in those days, these creatures would have been lining up for it. And these creatures, which were, as you'll probably guess, called the monkeys, because they were more competitive and more aggressive, and they lived in the same habitat as the lemurs, they successfully supplanted the lemurs everywhere in the world other than Madagascar, because Madagascar was right out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and they couldn't get there. They couldn't get there until about 1,500 years ago, when, due to startling advances in twig technology, they were able to get there in boats and eventually planes, and suddenly the lemurs that had had this place to themselves for millions and millions and millions of years were suddenly facing their old enemy, the monkey. So this is Madagascar. And it turns out that the rarest of the lemurs, and when I say the rarest of the lemurs, at this particular point in the mid-80s, they were thought to be the rarest of the lemurs. We've now discovered an even rarer lemur called the golden bamboo lemur, which went straight to the number one of endangered lemurs. But the aye-aye is a very, very peculiar animal. It looks like an agglomeration of all sorts of other different animals. So, for instance, it has a sort of fox's ears, and it has little sort of bitey rabbit's teeth, and it has a kind of ostrich tail, as an ostrich feather as a tail, and it has very weird eyes. It has Marty Feldman's eyes. They're kind of sort of looking slightly beyond you into a sort of other dimension just over your left shoulder. But it also has one very, very, very peculiar characteristic, which is its middle finger on both hands is skeletally thin and very, very long. And it turns out there's only one other animal in the entire world that has this feature. And this is called, I love zoologists to have such vivid imaginations. It's called the long-fingered possum. And this is a creature that lives in New Guinea. And in fact, it has its fourth finger that's skeletally thin and elongated. And this is the thing that tells us that there's no relationship between these animals. It's pure convergent evolution. Because the common factor between Madagascar and the aye-aye and New Guinea and the long-fingered possum is that in both habitats there are no woodpeckers. And you see, the thing is, life is very, very opportunistic, and it'll take advantage of any food source it finds around the place. And if there are no woodpeckers looking for the bark, looking under the bark of trees for grubs, then in this case it'll be the mammals that grow this skeletally thin long finger to burrow under the bark of the tree and get at this source of food, which is the grubs under the bark. So the aye-aye is this very, very, very strange creature. And at this time, it was thought there were only about 15 of them left. And they lived, actually not on Madagascar itself, but on a tiny little rainforest island just off the coast of Madagascar called Nosy Mangabey. And it was just off the northwest tip of Madagascar. Now, to get there, what you had to do is you had to fly in a 747 to Madagascar, and then in a terrible old jalopy of an aeroplane from Madagascar up to the northwest port. And from there, you had to go in a kind of decreasingly excellent series of carts and trucks and so on, to a little port where there was going to be a boat that was going to take us to Nosy Mangabey. So we arrived there and arrived at the port, and we were looking around for the boat that was going to take us to Nosy Mangabey, and we couldn't see it. And we kept on asking people, where's this boat? And they would say, it's there, it's there. And we couldn't see what they were pointing at because there was this terrible rotting old hulk in the way. Well, as you guessed, this is the terrible rotting old hulk that we had to go to Nosy Mangabey in. And it didn't fulfill what, to my mind, was the sort of basic criteria of a boat, in that it was basically full of ocean. And it seemed to me that the whole point of a boat was to keep the ocean on the outside. Anyway, so we crossed to Nosy Mangabey. And it's this tiny little, very, very beautiful little rainforest island.